Hi, everyone. Welcome to English Rise. This is a space created for people who are not only trying to improve their English, but also trying to understand themselves better in the process. Here, language is not treated as a set of rules to memorize, but as a mirror that reveals fear, discipline, identity, and self-control. If you are new here, feel free to stay, to listen calmly, and to allow these words to work slowly inside you. Now let's begin. Part 1. The silence that appears when you need to speak. There is a specific kind of silence that doesn't exist when you are alone. It doesn't show up when you are watching a movie in English late at night. It doesn't appear when you are listening to a podcast, understanding every idea, every emotion, every nuance. It doesn't exist when English enters your mind without resistance. In those moments, English feels familiar, controlled, almost comfortable. You understand. And because you understand, you assume something dangerous, that speaking should be easy. But then reality creates a different situation. Someone looks at you. Someone waits. Someone expects an answer. And suddenly, that silence arrives. Not around you, inside you. It is not loud. It is heavy. Your chest tightens slightly. Your breathing changes without you noticing. Your mind accelerates, searching for something that was there just seconds ago. The words do not disappear. They retreat. And in that moment, you are forced to face a contradiction that has followed you for years. You understand English, but you cannot access it when it matters. This silence is not accidental. It is not a lack of intelligence. It is not a lack of exposure. And it is definitely not a lack of effort. This silence was built, slowly, quietly, over time. You were trained to understand English in a passive state. From the beginning, English was something that came to you, not something that came from you. You listened, you read, you observed, you stayed safe. Understanding requires distance. Speaking removes it. Understanding allows you to hide behind comprehension. Speaking places you in the center of attention, and your nervous system knows the difference. When you listen, nothing is demanded from you. No one measures your accent. No one interrupts your sentence. No one watches your hesitation. But when you speak, you are no longer invisible. Your voice carries your uncertainty. Your pauses reveal your doubt. Your mistakes feel permanent, even when they are not. And your brain interprets this not as language practice, but as exposure. This is where most people misunderstand the problem. They believe speaking is blocked by lack of vocabulary. But vocabulary lives in memory. Speaking lives in identity. You don't freeze because you don't know what to say. You freeze because saying it feels like a social risk, an emotional risk, an identity risk. Your brain is not trying to sabotage you. It is trying to protect you. Protection, however, has a cost. Silence. Think about how you speak in your native language. You don't plan every sentence. You don't calculate grammar. You don't monitor yourself constantly. You exist inside the language. In English, you stand outside of it, watching, judging, correcting yourself in real time. This constant self-monitoring creates tension, and tension blocks flow. So when the moment arrives, when English is supposed to move from your mind to your mouth, there is friction. And friction produces hesitation. Hesitation produces silence. This silence is not emptiness. It is control. You are controlling damage. You are controlling exposure. You are controlling the possibility of being perceived as less capable than you wish to be. Silence feels safer than imperfection. And your mind chooses safety every time. But safety has consequences. The more you choose silence, the more foreign your own voice in English becomes. You understand more. You speak less, and slowly, a belief forms. I'm good at understanding English, but not at speaking it. This belief feels factual, but it is not. It is conditioned. Understanding English without speaking it creates an illusion of progress. You feel close, almost there, just one step away. But that step is never taken, because the step requires discomfort. And discomfort is exactly what your system has learned to avoid. This is where most people get stuck. Not because they are incapable, but because they are too controlled, too careful, too self-aware, too afraid of being seen while still unfinished. And this is only the surface. Because beneath this silence, there is something much deeper shaping your relationship with English. Something related to fear, identity, and self-image. That is what we need to explore next. Part 2. When language becomes a threat to your identity. The moment you try to speak English, you are no longer dealing only with language. You are dealing with identity. This is the part most people never notice, because it operates silently, beneath conscious thought. When you speak your native language, your personality flows naturally. Your humor works. Your intelligence shows. Your confidence feels intact. But when you speak English, that version of you disappears. Suddenly, you sound simpler, slower, less precise. And this contrast is deeply uncomfortable. You are not afraid of English itself. You are afraid of becoming a reduced version of yourself in front of others. A version that cannot fully express ideas. A version that cannot defend itself properly. A version that feels incomplete. So, unconsciously, you protect your identity by refusing to fully step into the language. Silence preserves who you believe you are. Speaking threatens it. This is why the fear feels irrational. You tell yourself there is no real danger, that making mistakes is normal, that people don't care as much as you think. And yet your body reacts as if something important is at stake. Because for your nervous system, it is. Your voice is not just sound, it is representation. When you speak, you represent who you are. And in English, you don't yet recognize yourself. So your mind does something subtle. It delays. It asks you to prepare a little more, to study a little longer, to wait until you feel more confident. This feels responsible. It feels intelligent. But it is avoidance disguised as discipline. You tell yourself, I'll speak when my grammar is better. I'll speak when my vocabulary is bigger. I'll speak when I can sound natural. But naturalness is not achieved in isolation. It is forged in interaction. And interaction requires exposure. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Every time you delay speaking, you reinforce the idea that your current level is not acceptable. And the longer you reinforce that idea, the more threatening speaking becomes. What started as insecurity slowly becomes identity protection. This is why some people study English for years and still feel blocked. They are not building fluency. They are building a mental wall. A wall made of rules, expectations, and self-judgment. And behind that wall, English stays theoretical. You don't experience English as a living system. You experience it as a test. A test you feel you are constantly failing. So your mind stays alert, monitoring every sentence before it exists. This constant monitoring kills spontaneity. And without spontaneity, language cannot flow. Think about this carefully. Fluency is not the absence of mistakes. Fluency is the absence of fear of mistakes. And fear lives in identity, not in knowledge. This is why consuming English feels easy. When you listen or read, your identity is not at risk. You are not being evaluated. You are not being perceived. You are safe. Understanding becomes effortless because there is no emotional cost. Speaking, however, has a price. It forces you to accept a temporary loss of status. You will sound less intelligent than you are, less articulate than you feel, less confident than you wish, and your ego resists that loss, not consciously, automatically. So your mind chooses the option that preserves self-image. Silence. Silence keeps your internal image intact. Silence avoids confirmation of insecurity. Silence maintains control. But silence also freezes growth. This is the paradox. The more you protect your identity, the less it evolves. The version of you who speaks English freely cannot be built without first letting go of the version who needs to sound perfect. And letting go feels like loss. This is why speaking English feels heavier than it should. You are not just forming sentences. You are negotiating who you are allowed to be while forming them. And until this internal negotiation is resolved, your mind will continue to hesitate. Not because it lacks English, but because it lacks permission to be imperfect in public. This brings us to a critical realization. Your problem is not linguistic. It is psychological conditioning. A conditioning that taught you that being wrong is dangerous and being silent is safe. But language does not reward safety. Language rewards participation. And participation requires a different relationship with fear. That is what we need to examine next. Part 3. The conditioning that taught you to stay quiet. Long before English entered your life, you were already being trained. Not in language, but in behavior. You learned, slowly and repeatedly, that mistakes have consequences. You learned that speaking incorrectly invites correction. That hesitation invites judgment. That silence most of the time goes unnoticed. And unnoticed feels safe. In school, answers were either right or wrong. There was little space for unfinished thoughts, little tolerance for confusion. You were rewarded for accuracy, not for exploration. So you adapted. You learned to speak only when you were sure. You learned to wait until the answer felt correct. You learned to measure risk before opening your mouth. This conditioning worked in your native language because mastery came with time. But when English entered the picture, the same rules became a trap. English placed you back into a beginner's position, and beginners are exposed. They hesitate, they struggle, they sound uncertain. Everything your conditioning taught you to avoid. So your system reacted logically. It tried to apply the same strategy that once protected you. Stay quiet, observe, prepare more. But language is not a math problem. You don't solve it by waiting. You live it by participating. This is why many people feel intelligent in English until they are asked to speak. Understanding allows you to stay in the observer role. Speaking forces you into the participant role. And participation removes control. Control is deeply comforting. Control allows you to avoid embarrassment. Control allows you to maintain an internal image of competence. Control allows you to delay discomfort. But control also blocks adaptation. And adaptation is the core of fluency. Your nervous system does not distinguish between social embarrassment and real danger. Both activate the same response. Heart rate changes. Breathing shifts. Thoughts fragment. This is not weakness. This is biology. When you try to speak English, your body enters a mild threat response. Not because English is dangerous, but because exposure has been labeled as such. So your mind does what it does best under threat. It simplifies. It reduces output. It chooses silence. This is why your thoughts feel clearer in your head than when they try to come out. Inside, there is no pressure. Outside, there is risk. Over time, this pattern reinforces itself. You avoid speaking. You feel relief. Your brain learns. Avoidance works. And anything that works gets repeated. Meanwhile, understanding continues to improve. You listen more. You read more. You absorb more. So the gap widens, your comprehension grows, your expression stagnates, and this creates frustration. A quiet, constant frustration. You start questioning yourself. Why can I understand complex ideas but can't say simple things? Why do others speak with less knowledge but more confidence? What is wrong with me? The answer is uncomfortable. Nothing is wrong with you. You are simply over-controlled. You are trying to perform English instead of allowing it. Performance requires monitoring. Monitoring creates tension. Tension blocks flow. This is why speaking feels unnatural. Not because English is unnatural to you, but because you are trying to control every step. You don't allow the language to move through you. You try to manage it. And language resists management. Think about moments when you spoke English without thinking too much. Maybe when you were tired. Maybe when you were emotional. Maybe when you stopped caring for a moment. In those moments, words came out. Not perfect, but alive. Those moments reveal something important. Fluency appears when control relaxes. But relaxing control feels dangerous to a mind trained to avoid mistakes. So you return to preparation. More studying, more rules, more mental rehearsal, and the cycle continues. This is not a discipline problem. It is a relationship problem. Your relationship with error, with exposure, with being seen while incomplete. Until this relationship changes, no amount of input will turn into output. Because output is not unlocked by knowledge. It is unlocked by tolerance for imperfection. And that tolerance is not learned intellectually. It is learned through experience. Repeated exposure. Surviving mistakes. Realizing nothing breaks. This realization is uncomfortable because it means there is no shortcut, no safe path, no way to speak fluently without first sounding unfluent. And this is exactly where most people stop. Not because they can't continue, but because they don't want to pass through this phase. The phase where identity feels unstable. But this phase is not optional. It is the doorway. And on the other side of it, English stops being something you understand and starts being something you inhabit. That transition is what we need to understand next. Part 4. Why your mind freezes even when you know the words. When you try to speak English, your mind doesn't go empty. It goes too full. Too many options, too many corrections, too many internal voices competing at the same time. One voice searches for vocabulary. Another checks grammar. Another judges pronunciation. Another asks if you should even speak at all. This internal noise creates paralysis. Not because you lack words, but because you are trying to choose the perfect ones. Your brain was never designed to analyze and perform simultaneously. Thinking and speaking happen in different systems. When you overthink, you block the system that produces speech. So the sentence collapses before it leaves your mouth. This is why you can explain something clearly in your head but fail to say it out loud. Inside, there is no time pressure. Outside, there is, and pressure exposes habits. Your habit is control, and control slows everything down. Part 5. The role of translation in your block. Most people who understand English but can't speak it are still translating. Not consciously. Automatically. You hear a question in English. Your mind moves it to your native language. Then it builds an answer. Then it tries to convert that answer back into English. This process is invisible, but it is heavy. Translation creates delay. Delay creates hesitation. Hesitation attracts attention, and attention increases fear. Fluent speakers don't translate, they respond. Not because they know more, but because they allow simpler structures. They don't search for the best sentence. They accept the first workable one. Your problem is not lack of complexity. It is excess of complexity. You want your English to represent the same depth you have in your native language. But fluency grows from simplicity, not from precision. Part 6. Why perfection feels necessary to you. Perfection is not a preference. It is a defense. You don't seek perfect English because you admire it. You seek it because imperfection feels unsafe. If you speak perfectly, no one can judge you. If you make no mistakes, no one can correct you. Perfection becomes armor. But armor is heavy. And language needs lightness. When you demand perfection, you delay action. When you delay action, you delay adaptation. And without adaptation, fluency never arrives. This is why progress feels slow, even when effort is high. You're investing energy into protection, not into movement. Part 7. The moment you realize silence is a choice. At some point, you begin to notice something uncomfortable. You are not silent because you can't speak. You are silent because you choose not to. The choice is not conscious, but it is real. You choose silence to avoid tension, to avoid exposure, to avoid temporary discomfort. And every time you choose silence, your brain learns that silence works. It keeps you safe, but it also keeps you exactly where you are. This realization hurts because it removes excuses. The problem is no longer English. The problem is avoidance. And avoidance feels logical until you see its long-term cost. Part 8. The cost of staying in understanding mode. Understanding without speaking creates a false sense of progress. You feel advanced, informed, close. But closeness is not movement. Over time, this gap creates frustration. You start feeling trapped between who you are and who you could be in English. You know more than you can express. And unexpressed knowledge turns into tension. That tension slowly becomes identity. I'm someone who understands, but doesn't speak. And identities, once accepted, are difficult to break. Breaking this identity requires a deliberate shift, not in study habits, but in behavior. That shift is uncomfortable, and that discomfort is where real fluency begins. This is where the path changes direction, and that is what we will explore next. Part 9. When speaking becomes an act of courage, not skill. At some point, something subtle needs to change, not in your English, in your relationship with fear. Because speaking English is not primarily a linguistic act, it is a psychological one. Every time you speak, you are not proving how much English you know. You are proving how much discomfort you can tolerate without retreating. This is why two people with very different levels of knowledge can sound equally fluent. One is not smarter. One is simply less afraid of sounding unfinished. Courage in language does not mean confidence. It means movement despite uncertainty. You speak before feeling ready. You finish sentences even when they are imperfect. You stay present instead of escaping into silence. And something important happens when you do that. Your nervous system learns. It learns that nothing breaks. That judgment is survivable. That mistakes are temporary. And once the nervous system relaxes, language begins to flow, not perfectly, but freely. Part 10. Why fluency is built in the body, not the mind. Fluency is not stored in rules, it is stored in patterns. And patterns are built through repetition under real conditions. Your body needs to experience English as something safe enough to express. Not safe in theory, safe in practice. This is why silent study has limits. Your brain understands English. Your body does not trust it yet. And trust is built through exposure. Every time you speak and survive the discomfort, you rewrite the internal map. English stops being associated with threat and starts being associated with action. This is slow, gradual, sometimes frustrating. But it is real. Part 11. Letting go of who you are to become who you need to be. There is a version of you who speaks English naturally. That version already exists in potential. but it cannot emerge while you protect the current one too much. You must accept a temporary loss. Loss of eloquence, loss of control, loss of certainty. This loss feels like regression, but it is not. It is transition. Every fluent speaker passed through a phase where they sounded worse than they wanted. They did not avoid it. They lived through it. This is the price of expansion, and expansion always feels like instability before it feels like growth. Part 12. When English stops being a performance. Eventually, something shifts. You stop trying to impress. You stop trying to sound advanced. You stop measuring every sentence. English becomes functional. You speak to communicate, not to represent yourself perfectly. And paradoxically, this is when your personality returns. Your humor comes back. Your opinions sharpen. Your presence stabilizes. Not because your English became flawless, but because fear stopped dominating the process. At this stage, fluency is no longer a goal. It is a side effect. Part 13. The real reason you were stuck. You were not stuck because you lacked discipline. You were stuck because you demanded safety in a process that requires exposure. You tried to think your way into fluency, but fluency is lived, not calculated. Understanding was never the problem. Silence was. And silence was never forced on you. It was chosen. Once you see this clearly, you cannot unsee it. And once you cannot unsee it, change becomes inevitable. Part 14. Closing the gap between knowing and becoming. There is a narrow space between understanding English and speaking it. That space is uncomfortable, but it is short. It is crossed not by studying more, but by acting sooner. Speaking sooner than feels comfortable. Accepting imperfection sooner than feels logical. On the other side of that space, English stops being something you possess and becomes something you live inside. If you understand English but can't speak it, this was never a failure. It was a phase where your mind arrived before your courage did. Here, at English Rise, we don't rush that process. We respect it, we understand it, and we move through it consciously. Not just to speak better English, but to become more disciplined, more self-aware, and more honest with ourselves. If this reflection resonated with you, stay with the channel. Not for shortcuts, not for promises, but for real growth. In language and beyond it. Thank you for listening.